They gave CB an alibi for the time of the shooting. Probably at least a half dozen women died. They set up a perimeter because they figured the townspeople were coming after them. We're at the Milton Cemetery in Milton, Florida, and this is the grave of John F. Collinsworth. He's an interesting guy. He was a pitcher on the local baseball teams back in the early 1900s and 20s and into the 30s, and reportedly very good according to all the newspaper articles, and pitched for a lot of years, and pitched in some higher organized leagues, but he never made it to the majors. But he was in the Southern League. He pitched in Pensacola, he pitched in Baghdad, he pitched here in Milton. All these teams and communities had baseball teams back then. Anyway, he was pitching against Freeport in East Milton over at Overman Park in 32 or 34, and pitching a shutout as it was. The game was called in the 7th inning because in the stands his brother Ab pulled out a knife and killed his wife and then killed himself, and for unknown reasons. And they're both buried at the Strickland Cemetery. But John was pitching, like I said, and of course it upset everybody. And they called the game, but Milton had like a 7-0 or 9-0 lead. And but John, he pitched for many years even after that. And after he was out of baseball, he got in a little bit of legal trouble, ended up doing some prison time for a few different crimes. But none of that should be take away from his prowess on the pitcher's mound. I just wonder why he never got called up to a major league team, because, like I said, he had a lot of success pitching around here. That's John. At the Milton Cemetery again, it's the grave of Cecil B. Penton, CB he was known as. He was the suspected trigger man in the S.G. Collins drive-by shooting in East Milton, 1931. And he actually had a trial in 1934 where Long John Collins, the victim's brother, who had been sheriff twice in Santa Rosa County, found out that CB was in prison over in Rayford on unrelated charges and had some snitches put in a cell with him. And supposedly CB told the snitches that he was the one that pulled the trigger on his brother over in East Milton. And so in 34, when he was out of prison, Long John had him arrested and brought back, and they had a trial for him, and he was acquitted. Supposedly there was a family named Bell who had a service station, and they gave CB an alibi for the time of the shooting. But there was an eyewitness, Alman Spencer, who was in front of the Imogene when the shooting occurred, and he saw the car come across the bridge into Milton, and CB was definitely in the car along with a couple other guys, one being Wade Cobb, the future sheriff. So CB's a rather interesting guy. He later got arrested for a bunch of burglaries and did some more jail time, but eventually cleaned his act up and lived until 1960.
There's something else I wanted to ask you about this. Isn't there some way we can read about it online somewhere?
Yeah, I've covered that, the whole Gaynor Collins murders and the trial of CB Penton on my blog, Judging Shadows, at blogspot.com. And you can find it on there along with a bunch of other stories.
So judgingshadows.blogspot.com is the place that people can, and this and so many more.
Yeah, or you can come to the Facebook page, Panhandle Mysteries and Mayhem. You might find something on there you like. April 20, 1912. And The Grudge, it said that George Allen testified against Frank Penton in the Corbin case. in the federal case, and Penton held a grudge, and they found him in the restaurant one day, and just Penton and his father, they found Alan, and they just went into a general shootout. Somebody said the ball is open, and they commenced a firing.
In what building was this in?
It was in a restaurant in Milton. I don't know.
A restaurant.
A restaurant.
What year? This was 1912.
Well, yeah.
Man, all the restaurants that I've been told about were from the 30s forward.
Yeah, I know. It's surprising how many they had. But, Spencer Gilbert Collins, he was the one killed in the drive-by in East Milton that C.B. Penton is accused of.
Okay. Go back over that just a little bit. We were over at CB's grave earlier.
Yeah, that was part of the whole Gaynor-Collins conspiracy and murder. Aubrey Gaynor was killed, and then 6 months later, on September 11th, S.G. Babe Collins was killed. He was the owner of Collins Construction Company and owned the brick house across from the Methodist Church on Berry Hill. And he was killed in the drive-by as a revenge for the Gaynor killing.
And that's all in Judging
Yeah,
Shadows.
it's all part of Judging Shadows. That's John Houston Collins. That's Long John. He was the sheriff on 2 different occasions. He was also mayor of Milton. He was also a postmaster in Milton. He was obviously a Mason. I think he was the Knights of Pythias, and he's quite a well-known Miltonite. And he's the one that actually suspected that Sheriff Mitchell, after his brother's assassination, wasn't doing his best, and heard the rumors about C.B. Penton and had some snitches put in a cell at Rayford, and eventually arrested him and brought him back here for trial, unsuccessfully.
CB still got away with it.
If he did it, which everybody thinks I think he did, or at least he was part of it. But yeah, he was acquitted at trial, and that was it.
But CB was eventually killed by somebody else.
Now, CB died on his own later.
Old age? Okay.
Well, he was 54, but he had gotten some more trouble after that for burglaries, and he had a little rough crowd he ran with. But he got married in the 40s and seemed to clean his life up after that.
Tell me about this.
Before Josephine died, Daniel Doolittle Wells and his wife were living over on Ward Basin. And there was an article in the paper about how an absurd amount of baby goats were born in one short time span. It was like 3 goats had 12 or 15 baby goats, I don't know. But anyway, Josephine died. Daniel moved over to Pensacola, and he was getting up in years. He was about 82, and his health was failing. So one day he got on a city bus and he rode over here to Milton. He got out to the post office, and he mailed a letter to Judge Bonifay, and he mailed a letter to the Stewart Funeral Home. And then he called a taxi and he came over here and told the cab driver to come back in 30 minutes. And he sat down next to his wife's grave and he shot himself in the heart. And Milton Cemetery had an attendant at the time that was here, I guess during the day, named, his last name is Leon Allen. And he heard the shot and he came over here and he found the body, so he called Deputy Enfinger. And they came over here, and on his body was a note attached to it, and it said to contact his daughter who lived in Daytona, and to contact the Stewart Funeral Home. And so all that was done, and this is where they buried him, right next to his wife. It says, "A seeker for truth." I guess at 82 years old, his truth was he was ready to rest with his wife. He was a well-traveled man. And census records showed him living in Albuquerque and living in Jacksonville. I think they actually lived out in, may have gone to California for a little bit, but he was an engineer. So he was a smart man, and they ended up back here in their older age, and his wife died. 3 years later, he had enough, I guess, and came over here and joined her.
Yeah. Well, there.
It's sad, but it's also, he went out the way he wanted to,
So
where he wanted to.
About 71 or 2 years old.
He was at 82.
82.
Yeah. like that headstone though.
Yeah, it's a nice headstone. Okay, I'm coming to you now. Go ahead and start talking.
John Wesley Penton was sheriff of Andalusia, Covington County. And he got in a dispute over some money owed, and he killed an unarmed man out in the street, a man named Crumpler. And he was tried by a jury of his peers and found guilty of murder. And he was supposed to report for his sentencing, but instead he left Alabama and came down here where he had family. And in 1891, the governor of Alabama sent out a warrant to Florida and other surrounding states for his arrest and extradition back to Alabama. And apparently there had been one attempt before when a couple of guys came over from Pensacola and they got run off real quick. So there hadn't been any other attempts until this one. And there was two detectives, one of them named Cheatham from Montgomery, two men from Washington County, Florida over in Chipley. One was a police officer, one was a civilian. And a man from Troy, Alabama, who probably knew him on sight. That's why he was picked. Well, they traveled here to Milton, and they got off the train about a mile west. And the one from Troy and one of the guys from Washington County came into Milton to see if they could locate John Wesley Penton. And the other ones waited in the woods. Well, they located him in a hotel/bar in Milton. And they went back and met up with the other ones. So they came into town, and when they came back into town, it was dusk, and there was some gas lighting going on. It was kind of dark, but there was a little bit of ambient light. Well, anyway, Penton at this time was standing out on the street talking to somebody. His brother Abner was in the area too, like close by. Abner is Frank Penton's dad, the one that did prison time later for killing George Allen. Well, anyway, they attempted to make an arrest. Now, there's different stories depending on which newspaper you read and which family you talk to. But some accounts say that they just walked up and shot him, and I find that hard to believe because then they would have had to move his body. So anyway, needless to say, they tried to arrest him. There was a shootout. There was general firing. There were many, many, many shots fired. Penton was killed. He was the only casualty, and he was killed, and they say he was hit by different calibers of bullets, and they think he was killed by friendly fire, but some other people say that the posse members killed him. Well, they commandeered a little buggy, a little cart, and they threw his body on it, and they got him to the L&N depot, which was the old one, not the one that's there now, but the one before it. And they set up a perimeter because they figured the townspeople were coming after him. And they called for a special train to come from Pensacola. And while they're waiting on the train, the town marshal, I think his name was Johnson or Jackson, well, he showed up, and they got into a verbal altercation until Johnson was decked and knocked out. Well, eventually the train came, they loaded the body, they all got on the train and went to Pensacola. There was a quick inquest held, and it was called at that time a justifiable homicide. They released the body so it could go back to the family, and in the posse, they got out of town. Well, after they got out of town, there was another inquest held at probably the family and the citizens of Milton, and they claimed it was murder. So then warrants went out for the posse members. Well, they were in Alabama by this time, and there was never any more court cases that I've been able to find out. So anyway, John Wesley Penton is buried here. His brother Abner and his nephew was Frank Penton, who I've talked about, and he's on judgingshadows.blogspot.com, as is a version of this story. Like I said, there's many different versions. And well, they're also buried in the cemetery over in another Penton plot, which is over in another part of the cemetery. Milton Cemetery is brimming over with local history. I mean, it's amazing. You can almost track the whole existence and timeline of the county and town from this cemetery. You can see a lot of the old names, the Jernigans and the Nowlings, Collins. There's a lot of Gainer graves here. It's amazing. Just Never, to me, it's never boring. I love coming out here and walking around.
Well, I'm glad you write up the old stories and you put the stories together with all these markers and people. Interesting.
So we're at the Milton Cemetery again. You never run out of stories in this place. But here's the grave of Martha Seabrook, who was later known as Martha Beck, and executed at Sing Sing in 1951. She was one of the Lonely Hearts murderers and a respected nurse here in Pensacola area before she got involved with Ray Fernandez and they started their murderous con they were doing on old widows. And next to her grave is her father, Stanley Seabrook, who had his own newspaper in Milton called The Index, and it was later bought out by the Gazette. And he worked for the Gazette for years as an editor, printer, jack of all trades, until he retired. And but Martha was brought back here after her execution in 1951, and that's the only marker is that old cemetery, funeral home marker. Probably a good thing. If she had a headstone, somebody probably would have stole it by now. But she had a bad childhood, and she was hormone problems, was overweight, and was teased unmercifully. She had a couple of children out of wedlock, even though she claimed to be married to an Army Air Corps man who died in World War II. That's never been proven. She eventually married a cab driver from Pensacola named Alfred Beck, and they eventually divorced. She was working at she was in charge, basically the head nurse of the Children's Hospital in Pensacola. I think it's now part of Baptist. And one of her co-workers sent an ad to a Lonely Hearts magazine in her name, and Ray Fernandez answered it and set up a meeting. And his thought was to swindle her out of her money, but when he found out she didn't have any, his idea was to just leave her and forget about her, but she wouldn't let him. She followed him to New York, persisted, and their evil partnership went from there. They were executed for a murder of a widow in New York, but they'd also killed a mother and a daughter out in Michigan, and at least one or two other ones. The final number is really unknown, but it was probably at least a half dozen women died.
It's really sad that this little prank of putting an ad in the paper with the Lonely Hearts Club took this desolate woman, this woman of despair and no love in her life, and she ends up attracted to this guy, and they end up she's led down the path of destruction and death.
And
Wow.
She admitted what she'd done, and when it was time for her to be executed, she said she was getting what she deserved. She didn't try to avoid responsibility. But I have no doubt in my mind if she hadn't hooked up with Ray Fernandez, that she probably would have led a life of despair, but I seriously doubt she would have killed anybody.
Yeah. What gets me is the strange little small things in life that end up turning out big, like just a little prank, and then it ends up her whole life turns on that. Well,
her brother Dudley Seabrook, he was a member of the Pensacola Police Department. He was a sergeant, and then later he was at University of West Florida security until he retired. But there's Martha and her father Stanley. And I don't know where her mother's buried. Hopefully she's not right here where I'm standing. But I haven't found her in the Milton Cemetery. It said in the paper in her obit that she would be buried in the Milton Cemetery, but I've never been able to find her grave. And you would think it would be here.
well,
If it is, it's unmarked.
so
And she was a Metz, and I've looked at other Metz family graves, and she's not over there either.
could be unmarked and everything right there.
Yeah.
Oh man, but he was the editor of the Press Gazette.
Yeah, well, he owned the Milton Index, an early newspaper back in the teens, in 1910, 1915. And then it was later bought out by the Gazette, and he worked for the Gazette for many years as editor, printer, jack of all trades. A respected guy. Walk over here to one of our more heroic members of the cemetery. Over here's the grave of Lieutenant Raymond Hobbs, and he was a crewman on a B-29 in World War II that was getting ready to, it was taken off from Guam. It was going from one base in Guam. It was supposed to land at another base for some maintenance work, and they took off and they crashed, and he was on board, and he died on the airplane, and he's here with the Hobbs graves, one of our World War II veterans. And Raymond Hobbs Sr. over there, and I think
this is the one here.
Yeah.
Well, he was married.
Yeah.
And had a child. No, right? She says wife and mother.
Oh. That would have been his dad there.
She died in 1997.
Yeah, she lived a long time. And that's how much life he probably would have had if it wasn't for the... See, they just got married in September of 43. He died in 45. Sad thing.
I guess if you want sad stories, you can find them in a cemetery.
Yeah, a lot of them here.
Felix
Corbin.
And
that's his wife, Durley.
Corbin. What's the story here?
All right. Shadow out of the way. Felix Corbin was from Georgia, and he had left Georgia on an assault charge, and there was a warrant out for his arrest. Well, he was staying down here in Milton, Florida, and he was taken into custody by Long John Collins, the sheriff, and his chief deputy, Frank Penton. And he was illegally, the paperwork wasn't right, he was illegally taken to Bruton, Alabama. And they met up with a sheriff from Georgia, and they put him on a train to send him back to Georgia. Well, eventually he got out of his charges up there one way or another, and he came back to Milton. Well, there were charges brought against Penton and Collins for basically depriving Felix of his civil rights by arresting him and taking him across state lines. So there was a federal trial in Pensacola, and charges against the sheriff were dropped, but Frank Penton was put on trial for violation of Corbin's civil rights, and eventually, after a couple of trials, I believe, it was dropped. It was no more prosecution. So he comes back to Milton, and one evening, Felix Corbin, who was staying in a boarding house with his wife over on Willing Street, is what I've been told, by the river, had just sat down for dinner, and somebody called his name out on the street. So he went to his front door and he opened his door, and he was shot 4 or 5 times, and he died. And eyewitnesses who didn't actually see the shooting, but they saw the aftermath, said that Deputy Frank Penton was walking away from the scene while everybody else was running toward it. And he was an ex-deputy by this time, I believe. But he was never arrested for this particular killing because they didn't have proof. But all the newspaper articles said Corbin was shipped back to Georgia and buried, but obviously he's here, and his wife is right next to him over here. But on Find a Grave, there's a grave marked for him here, and there's one for a cemetery over by Soperton, Georgia, with no headstone there. So I think this is him. Why would they do all this if he wasn't buried there? So Frank Penton was our local gunslinger. He killed, other than Corbin, if he did do that, he killed at least 2 other guys. He killed George Allen, who's buried right over there, and he killed a guy named Robert Fleming in a shootout downtown. And he was cleared of both of these. But in the Allen case, his father, Abner Penton, who's also buried in the Milton Cemetery way over there, he was sent to prison for manslaughter for 4 years. Frank Penton actually took a bullet from Allen, but he survived. And he was later killed. He was head of security at Pensacola Shipyard, and him and his roommate got in a fight over a woman, and his roommate killed him. And that was justifiable. He didn't get in any trouble for that because Penton was a known wild card there. So anyway, I've also written about Frank Penton on my blog, judgingshadows.blogspot.com, on the fast times and short life of Frank Penton.
You should buy a permanent web address for judgingshadows.blog and put that on your gravestone.
Yeah. One of those QR codes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Okay, James Cooper Gaynor is the father of Aubrey Gaynor, and he had a store in downtown Milton. I believe it was on Oak Street. But you see, he died in 31. His son Aubrey was assassinated outside his house in 1931, and I think Aubrey's death did a lot to bring him down because he died just a couple of months later. This Meeker Greenlee Gaynor was a businessman, never married, but he died on a business trip, or he had just got back from a business trip, but he died suddenly, some kind of illness. S.G. Babe Collins, who saw his grave earlier in the Collins area. And the story is, and I don't know how much of this part's true because I haven't been able to verify it, but the story is that the Collins Construction Company was being investigated for tax evasion, and Aubrey being the bookkeeper, naturally he was targeted to be a witness. And I don't know if he was a witness, if they ever got information out of him, I have no idea. But in March of 31, the offices for the Collins Construction Company, which was over across from the L&N Railroad Depot, is located now, it burned, along with a general store and the ice factory, which S.G. Collins had just sold a couple of months before to Gulf Power. Well, it burned down. There was also a gin over there and some other Collins-owned businesses that didn't burn.
A cotton gin?
Well, it was a gin. I don't know if it was cotton or what, but it was also over there. So there was a big fire that took down this whole building complex. And when they looked, they sifted through the ruins, they found the safe for the construction company, and the safe was empty except for some road bonds. The Collins Construction Company had built the road, Highway 37 they called it at the time, that went from Milton up to the state line in Dixonville toward Bruton. And they had completed that road. It wasn't paved or anything, but they had built a $30,000 bridge. And then later, like 10 years or so later, they came back and it was all paved and eventually changed to Highway 87, but at the time it was 37. So anyway, Aubrey Gaynor was arrested for arson for all this burning down. And no one really believes he did it. And he was acquitted in court. And this was in June of 31, I believe. Well, not long after his trial was over, I guess he was seeing which way the wind was blowing as far as his future. So he went over to Crestview and he bought a couple of drugstores and some other business investments, and he took out a $50,000 life insurance policy on himself. And then in July, one evening he took his wife and his daughter Betty, who was around 10, and they took Sheriff Mitchell's younger sister, Myrtle Mitchell, who was a friend of Betty's, and they took a drive over to Pensacola. And I believe they went to see the new bridge that was just opened that was going over to Casino Beach, which is now many bridges later, but it's the Bob Sykes Bridge. And they got back around 10 o'clock at night, and they dropped Myrtle Mitchell off at either her house or at the jail. And remember, that was when the courthouse was brand new. and the jail was up on top. So I don't know exactly where they dropped her off. Well, then Aubrey, his daughter Betty, and his wife Emily went home, and Aubrey let his wife and daughter out, and he parked the car in a separate garage. And as he left the car, he took his daughter by the hand. Somebody came out from behind the garage and shot him with a shotgun. The bullets ranging down through his chest. When he fell, he pulled his daughter on top of him because he still had her by the hand. And the assailant ran off. And he died the next morning. Of course, Sheriff Mitchell was called, and Wade Cobb was his chief deputy, who was later sheriff. He came to the scene, and it was night, so they did what investigating they could. They talked to witnesses. There was a guy from Naval Air Station that was taken into protective custody named Covington, and he was a few days later he was released. There was a black woman who was also taken into custody, and I think she may have seen something because she was kept for a few days and then she was released. And I think her name was Celestine Mitchell, I think, or Marshall, Celestine Marshall. So when they investigated the next morning, they found tire tracks and they found the shotgun. The shotgun was traced to a pawn shop, and it just so happened that it had been bought by Babe Collins, Spencer Collins, but he had reported it missing. Well, they also found tire tracks where they suspect the car was parked, where the assailant used for transportation, and the tire tracks showed 3 different types of tread. So Sheriff Mitchell had been given a tip, maybe by one of these people he had in protective custody, or maybe another witness that saw 2 individuals in a car in that area at the time of the shooting. So anyway, he tracked them down and he found their car, and guess what? Their car had 3 different types of tread that fit what was found at the scene. So he arrested Webb Allen, who was a nephew of Spencer Collins, Babe Collins, and he arrested William Wolfe. And they were put on a $25,000 bond. At the time of the shooting, Babe Collins himself was in South Carolina, drumming up business for Collins Construction Company. His lawyer, Lewis Truman, had taken a trip to Havana with his wife. And they had even taken out an ad in the papers saying they were going to be out of town for a few days, or a couple of weeks, to make sure everybody knew he wasn't in town. So anyway, with the $25,000 bond, and then Collins came back from Carolina, and they put him on a $25,000 bond also. But they didn't arrest him. They just put him on a surety bond that he would show up. Well, the lawyers for Wolfe and Allen went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court to have the bonds lowered. They said it was excessive. The court agreed. Wolfe's bond was actually dropped to 0. He was released. Allen was dropped to $5,000, and a few days later they raised the $5,000 and he was released. So the investigation continued. In September 11th, Spencer Collins went across the river to visit a business partner of him named Estes, and they talked outside. But when they got finished with their conversation, Collins got up to cross the road and get back in his car to head back into Milton, and as he was crossing the road, what was later identified as a Ford A model came slowly down the street. Someone extended a shotgun out the window and shot Collins. As he was falling, he said, "They've killed me. Get the license number, call the doctor." By the time Estes got there, he looked, the car was going across the Bayou Bridge, and it was too far to see any license. And they suspect the shotgun was tossed out into the bayou. And Dr. Timms and Sheriff Mitchell both arrived on scene, and he died shortly thereafter. And like I said in another one, Alman Spencer was outside the Imogene Theater, and he saw the car. He heard the shotgun blast because it was a lot quieter back then. You know, you could hear. And he turned to look, and he saw this car coming into Milton across the bridge, and it turned, and he recognized all 3 people inside the car. And one was C.B. Penton, and one was Wade Cobb, and one was I believe Francis Villar. It was a Villar. I'm pretty sure it was Francis. And this was all told to me by Alman Spencer's brother, Holly, long before he died.